Hey there friends, my name is Opti and welcome to another Mythology 101 video where I give you the tools you need to be your own mythologist. First off, check out the new background. I moved. Which means a bit of a better view for when I'm studying or writing, and it also means a new space for streaming. So make sure you stop by my Twitch page for my schedule and join us to help out our charity streams. Every stream is actually dedicated to charity, so if you'd like to try to make the world a better place, make sure you stop by and see what you can do to help out. In this video, I want to take a more focused look at dictionary definitions of myth and mythology. One of the biggest things I noticed when I started getting into myth studies is the disparity between what mythologists of all sorts take to be myth versus what dictionaries denote to be the subject matter and function of myths. The more I studied the work of other mythologists, the more I found that dictionary definitions were lacking in context. So my hope is to help bridge that gap of understanding between what is everyday use and what is application in and by the field of mythology. In our last video on the overview of mythology, I briefly mentioned how definitions of mythology are varied across the field as different mythologists each have their own notions of what constitutes a myth, which in turn affects what and how they study when they apply their own theories. This statement actually also applies to how different dictionary sources also define mythology. So what I'd like to do in this video is to take a look at what we might be able to learn from these kinds of sources, rather than just dismiss them outright. Even though I believe that you need to evolve beyond dictionary definitions themselves to get into the field of mythology. With that being said, let's get started. In our last video, we started out our journey in this channel with crafting a simplified definition of mythology to use as a reference point for asking critical questions of what it means to be a mythologist. For those who haven't watched that video yet, we define mythology simply as the study of stories. I crafted this simple definition from just a few Google search results to help emulate what kind of general definition a budding mythologist might create when just hopping into the internet and running a quick Google search. So let's take a more in-depth look at these definitions from a current Google search and go over why I would personally have any aspiring mythologist ultimately evolve beyond these. And while myth and mythology are sometimes used interchangeably, I want to make a distinction in defining them as two different words with different definitions for today's video. Mythology is its own word used to describe the study of its root word myth. So in looking at any definition of mythology, looking at what a mythologist's idea of a myth is just as important as asking what the scope of their studies are. The first result from our Google searches from the Oxford Languages Dictionary gives two definitions. One being a collection of myths from a particular religion or culture. The secondary definition being the study of myths. Not bad, both of these are solid definitions, if a bit simplistic. Mythology definitely involves the study of religious and cultural materials, though it still begs the question as to what they consider to be the boundaries of myth, which Oxford defines as a story that involves a cultural's scientific or sociological background. A definition that is somehow both a vague net being cast over the subject matter of myths, but also limiting in what it considers to be a myth at the same time, because it mentions only two subjects that myth can be, but does nothing to delineate the reaches of mythology within those subjects. This other definition we'll cover in just a bit. Dictionary.com's quick and easy definitions come up with, again, a particular body of myths. Myths collectively, which I'm honestly not even sure what that means. Like, is it referring to like all myths? Like just any and all myths together across the world? The science or study of myths. Don't know if I called mythology a science, but definitely a study. And one interesting definition of a set of cultural stories or beliefs that arise naturally or are deliberately fostered. This last part is actually important to consider because mythology can, and has been, and still is, used for benevolent as well as nefarious purposes. So what is Dictionary.com considered to be a myth? Well, their first definition is the one that's the most pertinent to us, which is a traditional or legendary story, usually concerning some being or hero or event, with or without a determinable basis of fact or a natural explanation. Especially one that is concerned with deities or demigods and explains some practice, rite, or phenomenon of nature. And not gonna lie, this definition is a bit of a mess syntactically, but it does have some factors I think are important, specifically referencing that myths are cultural explanatory narratives, while also giving a few ideas as to the subject matter of myths. And these last few definitions, again, we'll hold off on for now. Merriam-Webster lists mythology as first an allegorical narrative, which isn't wrong. Myths are in fact stories, but this is a bit of a dated, incomplete notion because mythologists have been looking beyond just the narrative aspects of myths to gain further insight into what could be considered a myth. Also, like Oxford, Merriam-Webster also has mythology defined as a collection of myths, also referred to as a mythos, but we'll get to that one in a vocabulary video a little bit later down the road. But the two definitions I really want to focus on are the third and fourth ones listed here. The third definition is the one I actually like the best so far, which is a branch of knowledge that deals with myth. Even though it's still a bit vague in its scope, I do like that it's not just the study of myths and opens up the idea that mythology is an entire area of knowledge to be explored and known. It feels more like opening a door to a wealth of knowing as opposed to just the singular study of only one point of human culture. Alright, let's address the elephant in the room. Along the way, I've been holding off on addressing a few of the secondary definitions, all of which relate to a common theme of myth, which is that myths are a quote-unquote widely held but false belief, which is a definition I want to give some specific attention to in the future, but I feel it needs at least a brief mention now. We all know those internet articles, those news reports, and common sayings that say something is a myth, like 10 myths about brushing your teeth, or 10 myths about a certain historical figure. This is a definition that we ultimately want to avoid because it gives the idea that myths are just falsehoods. But as a mythologist, whether or not a myth is true, that is, determining whether or not the material is factual, is not our sole objective, if our objective at all. The field of mythology proper is concerned with finding the undercurrents within what we consider myths to be, that drive us as a species both to create them and partake in them. So no matter how fictional a myth might be, we can still learn something about the human experience from its study. But more on that later. And what are the myths that Merriam-Webster is studying? Well, myths, to them, are a usually traditional story of ostensibly historical events that serves to unfold part of the worldview of a people or explain a practice, belief, or natural phenomenon. A very singular, almost universalist definition, one that makes sense, but again misses the wider schema of mythology because myths don't have to be based on something that has happened historically or naturally. Myths can also be based entirely on an idea or an abstract concept like heroism or greed. So let's assess real quickly before we move on. Of the dictionary definitions we've gathered here, it becomes apparent that to these authorities, myths and mythology can be defined by the use of narrative stories, the inclusion of cultural and religious materials, belief, that is, something people adhere to, not just religious or cultural dogma, and a more general use to mean a story or a collection of stories. So if we were to now take our simplified definition of mythology, the study of stories, and expand that, it might instead say that mythology is studying the narrative efforts from the past made to create allegorical stories about a particular cultural belief or practice. Simply put, it essentially says that mythology is studying stories to understand cultural beliefs or practices from the past. What's really nifty about the approach that we just used is that each of these aforementioned definitions only holds a piece of these themes, meaning the more definitions that you were to come across and study, the more you would start to actually notice some of these common ideas, which is kind of cool because that's what being a mythologist is, looking at different pieces of information to find common undercurrents of thought throughout them. So this whole video has been like a mini lesson on mythologizing. Pretty cool, right? Okay. Now that we've done that, here's the thing. Merriam-Webster, Oxford, Dictionary.com, they're not mythologists. Those definitions are based upon agreed usage in everyday conversations as opposed to a definition that was created and entrenched in the field of mythology itself. They're meant to give a snapshot definition of what mythology may be at a glance when two people are just talking with each other, which is fine. But for the aspiring mythologist, we need to consider what one's own definition of mythology is, for the sake of guiding the lenses that we're going to use to look at myths. In fact, for our next venture, I'll actually be sharing the kinds of definitions that practicing mythologists used to give you a better idea of how mythology looks in the field. That's all for now though. Thank you so much for your time, and be sure to subscribe for more Mythology 101 videos and the future pop culture analyses. And feel free to follow me on social media. You can kind of keep up with the different things that I'm doing. And stop by our Twitch channel, which I'll play you a clip from on the way out. Just a reminder that every single stream that we do is a charity fundraiser, and we switch those fundraisers out every month. My goal is to try to spread as much light to the world as I possibly can. But before I go, I submit this to you. While mythology seems to be a part of our everyday space, it's in our shows and movies and games and books, we hardly ever take the step forward into the realm of mythical thinking. Just beyond the tabloids that pose 10 myths about something, and the everyday use of the myths of yesteryear as characters in a cartoon, there lies a deeper world to explore just beyond the veil. Till next time, my friends, be well and be loved.
Okay. Alright, shortcut number 1's dead. Done. Bro, don't sneak up on me like that, man. I'm a little jittery right now.